But yeah, hey everybody, welcome to a special installment of the I Think I Can't Speak for Everyone Here reading series. Today I'm super excited to be in conversation with Darren C. Demaree about his new upcoming collection, out November 7th, from Small Harbor Publishing, entitled So Much More. Darren Demaree is the editor-in-chief of the Best of the Net Anthology and the managing editor of Ovenbird Poetry. He is currently working in the Columbus Metropolitan Library system. Some words of others toward the work So Much More, which we're in conversation with today, include these are not only poems of anger and frustration, they also express grief at what was lost, and they envision a future inside the daughter, inside the cicada, inside the deer. From Marion Chan, author of Leaving Biddle City. Also from Megan Neville, author of The Fallow, says this book's craving for peace and comfort is palpable, is gratifying in its familiarity, yet startling in its keen descriptions of destruction and disappointment. It is a book to revisit again and again. I had my own words for the work, which included this verse is the star stuff of purpose and confrontation, signs, tattoos, vacated crows, the unreminded world, a shape-shifting violence that roots us to form. Our children lovely enough to be terrified. With that, I want to welcome everyone and give the floor to Darren briefly to introduce himself and say any opening statements he may have about the collection.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me. And last time I got to read for you, it was a lot of fun. And this time, getting to talk about the work a little bit more in depth is great because that's sort of uh, how you form those final opinions of it, because you spend so much time going granular, especially right leading up to a book coming out, where you've got final book meetings going over commas and the word that, which apparently I have a tick using the word that, because let's say 19 of the last 25 edits were like, do we need that? So going bigger picture with it and getting to sort of think of the things that helped me put together the book, which was a challenging book to put together, because the impetus behind this book was that I had these sequences that all began as book leak sequences that were all, somewhere between 70, 120 poems long, and none of them stood up on their own. There were some things I was incredibly proud of in the poems, but it's a complicated thing to put together a book length sequence that actually works. I've talked a lot in the past about mapping it out the same way you map out a narrative arc. There need to be sort of escalators. There needs to be things that you hit the brakes on. There need to be themes that develop and sort of tuck back in. And it's tough to get a reader to go with you on a book length poetry sequence. So I think my hit rate, I think about a third of them have actually um, worked completely. And the ones in here were the ones that really didn't stand up on their own. But when I was going over the work and not wanting to let those things go because I was proud of what I was attempting to do, I was able to sort of quilt together something that I think stood above what the book league sequences hadn't done. Um, and one of the things I've talked about in terms of something like this is I like showing the failure. I like showing that, I mean, there's a way where you could get rid of the numbers or change the numbers or do things like that in those sequences, and people wouldn't bat an eye. They'd be like, "Wow, he really planned this out." And I like showing the gaps. I like showing that it didn't quite work. And I like that the editing process becomes part of the final product where you're like, no, 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 it worked. Here's how it worked.
Yep, yep.
Um, and it's tough to pitch that sometimes. And I had a little bit of like my first slightly contentious interview for this book, where I was making the point that I would much rather write a bad poem than not write a poem at all. That the practice of it, the routine of it, what I get from even failing is important to me. And some of that comes through what my goals are as a sober person in that routine. And some of it is that I want to experiment and I want to push my voice. And um, I guarantee that folks would be happy if I just wrote Emily poems till the end of time, that people would be okay with that. And I write a lot of those, but for me, it's the experimentation. It's just trying new things. It's even going to form occasionally, like I did in the luxury. And for this, it was a lot of prose poems and messing with punctuation and different things, which might have been what got in the way of like the book leak sequence part actually working.
Yeah.
I was doing too much with language and too much with punctuation and things like that to have that sort of arc work. Um, but in the end, coming back to it and these images and these ideas and capping them off with those political prose poems, it built into something I ended up being really proud of, and I'm glad Harbor felt the same way.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the I've been in conversation with your work for a while. One of the things about this collection that for me was a little different was uh it felt like an album, right? Where there's uh it didn't seem to be uh invented to have like singles, right? It was
Right.
kind of it kind of came together as like you're not going to get it unless you engage with like the whole thing.
Sure.
Um, and kind of the end result was a little uh yeah, it felt like an album more than something that was created to have singles, and you kind of had to be
Mm.
there for e- every every section of the book to kind of get the whole feeling. Not that there wasn't a standout uh
Sure.
or whatever as it went, but yeah, I think sometimes um as you said, it's hard to uh number one, get a publisher, but also convince yourself that the failure is worth it. You
Yeah.
know, uh
Well, and so like these weren't written in chronological like tracking, like choosing what went where and how it was going to build into those um, political poems at the end of it, and sort of leading the reader to here's these dynamic things at the end. Here's why they matter to me, and they don't build like that unless you talk about empathy, unless you talk about imagining a daughter being born in um, 20 would have been she's 6 now, so 2018,
yep,
in right on the cusp of COVID, um, right, Trump as president,
yep,
and like um, how all those things interplayed and came together to lead to some of the poems at the end of this book I think are some of my best, but that's um, I think maybe because they speak more to who I am as a person and less as a poet.
yeah,
So
yep,
um, and there might not be and I behind the curtain, so the next book that's going to come out is the 20 years. It's going to be the selected poems book next year around this time, and there are more than a few poems from this book that made it in there because this feels like that sort of jumping off point to I know 43 doesn't feel like an aged poet, but I feel that I've reached a certain form in terms of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, which to me means the next time I do a poetry project, that I got to completely fuck with it, that I've got to
yeah,
completely be
yeah,
like, well, we're going to do this from a different angle this time. You feel confident
yep,
right now? You feel good? All right,
yeah.
let's
Here we
let's
go.
do this. And that's one of the things that I always talk about in terms of like, I'm a lifer, right? I got no idea if this is leading to a grand place, and I don't care. Like the practice and the routine and how I want to have these conversations about what art can do and about what poetry and language can do and why they matter. That can be a lifelong goal.
Yep,
Uh, and getting to talk about why I think that way in conversations like this is a bonus. It's great. because you get to explain a little bit. But if they just found the work eventually, and I,
Mm.
and there's no way there's a completist. You might be the closest to a completist of my work, sincerely, right? I
Yeah.
maybe Tana as well. So like the two people in this world that have maybe read all my books are here with me now, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting too when you talked about the sequence of things and they weren't written in order. It's interesting to me how uh, if you if you're following your obsessions, if you're in conversation with other work, it's not like I don't feel being a completist or whatever. But I think part of it is because your work doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's in conversation with other work. It's not just hey, I create and create and create. It's on the shoulders of other things, and sometimes creation uh can shift the timeline. So,
Yeah.
everybody always wants chronological or this or that, but I think being obsessive about it and attending to it constantly
Mhm.
can make a work that uh, like so much more that says it's abstracts, unfinished sequences,
Mhm.
political prose poems, but um it's not like you abandon those things and then found them later, right? You're in
Right.
conversation with them constantly.
Mhm.
So and that's kind of what I was speaking to too when I felt this collection was more of an album
Yeah.
or something. Um,
Well, and that engagement you're talking about, it includes, it's not just the writing process, but the reading process.
Absolutely.
And so reading something, I always take it as, oh, I get excited. It's not just like, I'm not daunted by reading someone who's more talented or doing things differently than I'm doing. I'm like, okay, this is exciting. Let's go.
Yep. Absolutely.
Um, and it's a mind frame that without sort of second guessing and the ability to take big swings without being worried about it. Um, I had it was a very positive interview with, I think, the folks from Five South a few years ago. And they were like, it feels essentially like they did a Darren Demaree day. They did like a review and an interview. And I was like, whoa, this is fucking cool. Um, and they asked me sort of like, well, this feels like you're on the cusp of something, or this feels like the momentum or something. And what I said was like, cool. Um, but right now this feels perfect. Like I
Yeah.
don't have
Right. Right.
to knife fight to get a book published, but really nobody knows who I am. And that just means that I can take big swings. And if it doesn't work, I mean, I've had reviews pan me. That's fine. That's okay. I don't take that personally, unless they're like, well, he's an asshole too. And I'm like, well, okay,
Right. Right. Yeah.
I'm
Well, I
trying.
think too, like when people start talking about uh, yeah, best what I think that like I bet you have this too, but where your work is at, right?
Yep.
So like when I when I look at my work, or it's never like I'm never going to be here. And what I know is that whatever I did currently was where I am. Like
Yep.
it wasn't a regression, it wasn't whatever. It's about kind of forwarding your own growth as a writer,
Hmm.
not in comparison, but being like, look, I know that for the writer I am now, that was the best I could do.
Yeah.
And I, tackled that inquiry or tackled that interrogation in a way that fit
Mhm.
my obsessions.
Sure.
Um, and that's why sometimes I get a little, with publishing and with all these things, it's like
Yeah.
these are all good. These are all good things. Like
Hmm.
they're like benefits. They're
Yeah.
whatever. But if you don't know where your work's at,
Hmm.
um, then maybe you need to revisit some things, and that's kind of I think with work I engage with, I can tell that the if I feel the writer is like, look, this is where I'm at. You know, I'm not trying to say that it's this or that, but if you know where your work is for the work you've put into it, I think
Hmm.
that's a I think that's a plus.
Well, and like, so this makes me sound entirely middle brow, but it's the trying that matters to me. It's the effort, it's the routine. I don't feel the same way anywhere else really in terms of artistic expression than when I'm trying to accomplish something when I'm a poem, whether
Mhm.
it's linguistically, whether it's topic theme, whether I'm trying to get at the big whatever of life. Like, I don't feel the same way really anywhere else in terms of like job pursuits, any of these things, than when I'm trying poetry.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I understand that there's top of the mountain stuff, perspective about arts and all that. I get it. I do. And I'm aware of all of it. But personally, as a human body trying to do something,
Yep.
like the trying is what matters. The focus on the work is what matters. And when we get to have conversations like this, it's a little bit wild because honestly, what I want to do is tell you what I'm working on now and kind of be
Right,
like,
right. Yeah, yeah.
so I'm bad at promotion. I'm bad at
Yep,
not this. This is fun. Like this
yep,
conversation's fun, but like promoting things because I'm much more excited about what I tried to do this morning.
yep. When I think poetry especially lends itself towards erasure, where like when I write something, I'm always trying to just like make people forget about what I wrote yesterday, right? Or pay attention to something else. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting endeavor where uh people that engage or things that touch people might have been something that was that's not in whatever presence you're in now. But yeah, but I think that speaks a little bit to how creation can kind of like mess up that timeline, right? Like someone comes to your work like 2 years from now,
Yeah.
um, and you might be working on, you might feel insecure 2 years from now about where you're at. Like it's an
Mhm.
interesting, any kind of art is an interesting wormhole, uh, where you kind of if you're going to put something out there, sometimes you have to speak to it when you're
Yeah.
when you're
No,
past it or something.
I know what you're saying. And then there are things where if you're trying a lot of things, they're gonna hit differently for different people.
Yep,
Um, and so I'll always be thankful for Two Towns Over and Neverwell because they were about addiction, both Ohio's addiction and then my own. And those open doors for me to be a part of a community that gives back to folks going through that kind of
absolutely.
experience and
Yep,
getting to go to Maryhaven or getting to do different workshops for folks around Ohio. And so that will always mean a lot to me. But it's been a while since I've sort of written about that because it's hard and because it's that topic and because that topic hits home differently for people. Um, that'll get brought up and I have trouble in those conversations. I was
yep,
on a panel at AWP in Philadelphia about new sobriety narratives, and I had trouble sort of in that environment talking through it. Um, so it just depends on where the reader finds you and what they want to talk about and
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
what
absolutely.
what hits for them. And if you're doing a lot of different things, there's going to be some stuff that they love and some that's like, whatever.
Yep.
Why'd you
One,
spend
and I
your
think,
time?
yeah, and sometimes it's like, are you messenger or are you? Yeah,
Yeah.
I get where um is it the work or is it the message? Because it should be kind of both.
Yeah.
Um,
So
but
like
yeah,
these brilliant things you're writing with Ethan Hawke sort of as a framework, right? Um, what if someone doesn't like Ethan Hawke? Like,
right, absolutely.
or what
Or
if they're
I think I thought about this later, but it's like, what if he, what if he turns out to be a terrible
oh
person?
yeah, yeah.
Beyond the celebrity that I know or the work that he puts out that I know, and I'm like, I'm risking dating
Mhm.
myself or like deleting
Sure.
everything. But then again, when you're in a conversation with any art, it becomes more about the symbolism and about what the art represented. I guarantee if I had to sit down with Ethan Hawke at any point, I wouldn't even know how to begin
Yeah.
a conversation. Interesting enough, and it's just kind of speaking of, you don't know where you're going to hit, or yeah. So the Ethan Hawke poems, actually, I was going to keep to myself. They were
Okay.
supposed to be just for me, and then, you know,
Mhm.
people really liked them, and then, but I was done with it by the time. Anyway, so I put the collection out, but I was kind of done with it. But yeah, I guess
Mhm.
uh, someone I recently met on Instagram really liked them, and they convinced a bookshop in Kyoto, Japan, to like stock the books.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and it's just the weirdest.
Yeah.
It's just a weird thing, but those are things I kind of like about. You know, you might meet someone that has similar. They put stuff out similar in the world the way you do,
Hmm.
um, and then they say something, and then suddenly Ethan Hawke poems in Kyoto, Japan. I guess
Yeah.
that's how
That's fun.
that's how that works. But yeah, I feel like uh you know yeah, kind of speaking about a little bit when you were speaking about the new sobriety and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. You know, I my youngest son is disabled, has a lifetime disorder and this and that. And I recently was on a interview where I mentioned that sometimes writing kind of, it stops time. Like,
Mhm.
it's like if you do it constantly, it's the same thing every day, so it kind of stops time. And I was thinking kind of I think Ohio and addiction, all
Mhm.
those kinds of things are kind of the same thing, right? Where it's one story, and it kind of, you can tell it really well, but addiction and uh, any kind of thing like that tells one story constantly.
Yep.
And I was curious as to I know you've mentioned this before, but um, your attention to attendance to poetry or to writing, um, kind of is something you're doing besides this other thing, and can kind of maybe stop time or whatever. And I was just curious as to, uh, do you feel that writing does that for like
Mhm. Well, and
kind of
it's, yeah, I do. And I think it's a thing where, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, so I'll be 13 years sober, January 24th. And, in that first, like, say, 7 years, I literally wrote to try to stay alive, where you're so unsteady, and legitimately went to, uh, rehab to, I don't, not to get sober, but as like, well, I should do this, but I'm special, so don't worry about it. And and then you find, and then all of a sudden it's been 6 months since you drank, and the reason why was uh, this crazy routine of working out and writing and these things, and you become terrified to stop. And then 7 years passes, and it's marking that time, and you're looking back, and the unpoet thing to say is that the poetry didn't matter, that it was a tool, and I'm alive, and great. Um, but there's a reason why I've written the number of books that I've written, and because for 7 years I wrote like it was going to keep me alive.
you know,
And then it takes a little while to be, well, no, I want to do this. Like I want to take a challenge. I want to experiment. I finally became the poet that I talked about being when I was in grad school, however many years
yep,
ago,
yep,
where I was
absolutely,
like, obsessed with Ase Berg and Samuel Monash, and these people that would do this kind of work. And, for so long, I didn't, I was writing poetry. I wasn't thinking about it as deeply as I was, let's say, 10 years ago. It just, the process was different. And finally figuring out two things that really have led to a better quality of life for me. One being that I don't have to write something every day, that I'm not going to die, that I'm not going to drink, that I can process more and plan more and put that kind of legwork into things before I even start a project. Because so often it would start and I'd figure out what I was doing along the way and then put together a book. And because people have been incredibly generous to me with their time and some money, um, they would publish it, and that's great. Um, but let's say the last 5, 6 books, other than a few of them early, you can tell that there's form and craft, and there's more than an inciting incident happening. And looking at the selected poems book, I was like, well, okay, there's a lot of like lit sticks of dynamite here. And then there's like some things I built. Um, and then the second thing being that I finally understood that if I were to ever relapse, that if I were to ever have a drink again, that it didn't mean that I would have to die, that there would still be forgiveness, that there would still be poetry, that there would still be my family, because so much of the formulation of you as a person who is in recovery is that if I do it again, the world will end. If I don't do all these things, if I don't do this routine, if I don't, the world will end. And to give myself enough of a deep breath and enough grace as a person in the world that, I'm not going to drink right now. I'm not going to drink tonight. I can't tell you about tomorrow, but if that happens, that sucks. That's terrible. I'm going to owe a lot of people a lot of apologies, but it's not going to be the end of things.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah. So,
it's weird that it took that long.
yeah.
But
Well, I think too, like, yeah, anything you step back from, you're like, it's weird that it took that long, right? Because you still feel like the good person you
yeah,
felt like then, but you kind of went from, and this is can be analogous to a lot of things, but you went from being terrified to stop to
mhm.
giddily wanting to continue, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's I think that's a worthy uh
Well,
endeavor.
and there's always more survival in joy,
Yep,
right?
absolutely. Yep,
And even if I'm writing about incredibly difficult things, and like Neverwell was that kind of thing, right? So that was personal and about my addiction, and some real honest things in there that are shameful. You can't write that book without being able to survive the process of it and without knowing why you're doing it, um, and embracing the challenge and being excited about the challenge.
yep.
And it's, I know I'm older, so saying it's mature is like a cop out kind of thing, but you know, it feels better to be challenged. And before I was not willing to be challenged. I was just writing.
Right. Yep. And I think too, there's that element of sometimes you fake it till you make it,
Yeah.
and then you make it, and then you have to fake it again, like in a
Yeah.
way. But I I think that I wrote about early on, like I wrote about death and poverty, like all these things, and
Mhm.
they were all real. But then you get older and you realize that all your questions about those things, it's a good thing you did the ground you did it's a good thing you did the groundwork.
Yeah.
It's a good thing you laid the base, um because then when you have to actually like question those things or talk about those things,
Mhm.
you got all the junk out. um
Well,
uh,
and excuse the ex-athlete part of me, but like even writing poems that don't work is still flexing that muscle, right?
yeah,
There
yeah,
there is a
absolutely.
practice and a skill set and a strength that's developed
Yep.
through repetition and trying things. Um, and I think you get better
Yeah. Mhm.
just by doing it over and
Yep.
over and over again. And not,
And I think
yeah,
that better comes from, you know, your own. your own gauging of it, right?
Mhm.
You know when you haven't been working out for a little while and you get
Yeah,
back into it and stuff, but you know where your stuff is at, like
sure.
um, how that's going, uh, and where it might have been okay in the beginning to
Mhm.
constantly flex that muscle you already had.
Yeah.
Um, that that's not going to sustain you.
Mhm.
Um, and stuff. You have to kind of
Well,
keep looking at it and
yeah,
whatever.
and it's not about like putting it all together
Yep.
and then you've written the one brilliant book you write in your life.
Yep.
And, I have friends that work like that, that are like, I'm building towards this one thing. And I respect that because there's so much of it's like treading water for years, how much effort and how much, and when they finally, it's brilliant. Um, I'm just not put together that way.
Right. Right.
Um,
Well, I think too sometimes I think Johannes Jorgensen talks about when people talk about like mastery of like anything that says mastery or top or ace
mhm,
kind of denigrates the process itself. But then again, when even when there is mastery is very brief,
oh, sure.
because a month from now, from when mastery was achieved,
Mhm.
a month later, someone
Well,
else achieves a different
and it's
mastery.
just you find the mastery in it because it's flawed in the way that you want it to be flawed. Like
Right, right.
the people that are my favorite poets that I read constantly are the ones that challenge me and I can't figure out how they do what they do. So those are the people I want to spend time with because just a giant word nerd and I want to be able to figure out and I can't. And that's exciting, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like I think the movie Zodiac is one of the best films about obsession, where
Mhm.
it didn't even become about it. It wasn't in the end about the knowing. It was
Mhm.
about the process to get to a point where you might know why the world is so awful. Um, and I think with any good art, that should be the journey. You know, it's a common trope to be like, oh, aliens came down here to find out, why what makes us human, like in every movie or whatever. But it's actually not the interesting question. I think the interesting question is what makes us inhuman, like what makes us terrible at certain points.
Mhm.
And I think any good art kind of wants to get kind of at that. Otherwise it's just treading water. Um treading water and mastery. Um but
Yeah.
so yeah, sorry, I got a little off
No, you're
track
good.
there.
That was fun.
But so yeah, I kind of had some already prepared questions, and I was
Sure.
hoping that the conversation would take a different turn, which it did. Um, Only because my anxiety makes me want to control everything, so I always want things to go. But did want to kind of talk about So in this work and in your work in general, there's kind of this overwhelming underneath of want, but it's not insular. It kind of has this kind of apocalyptic inclusivity, where it seems concerned with um, how local things can reach out to the universal, sort of
Mhm.
family, stranger, reach and carry. In I think one of your lines in this book is move on without terror. Take the child's hand to move on without terror.
Mhm.
And I just kind of wanted to ask about there is a stillness to witness
Mhm.
that is kind of anathema to vision, right? Like where vision is projected, or or something. So anyway, I kind of wanted to, maybe you could speak to how writing towards that moving on without terror, um, how do you balance vision as a thing projected kind of with this the stasis of having to witness the current moment.
Yeah. Well, and the challenge with that is, especially like if I talk to young writers, I talk about music and energy of poetry and entry and exit points, like those two things, and how those are some of the hardest things to work towards in poetry. And so the stillness is something that always feels like it evades me. Um, Even in like the luxury. So I used that form because I wanted it to feel constricting. I wanted it to feel like we didn't have oxygen. Because to me, that's what syllable counts feel like, is that I can't breathe. Um, but the agitation and the projection and going and looking at my children as I think and feel these things, which bring me back from hopelessness, bring me back from not wanting to fight sometimes. Um, but it's it's an impossibility when you put together these landscapes and these challenges and this environment and then my children,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so here when I read here in a little bit, like um the with an empathy so fatal sequence in there, where I talk about sending my children out into the world, that for me creates a great agitation. And it's tough to forecast, it's tough to do so with enthusiasm, like when they leave the house or when what's going to happen, when they move away, what's going to happen. Um, and it feels like everyone's narratives keep getting interrupted by these terrible things. Um, and I'm not special and they're not special and nothing's going to avoid what's whatever's going to happen. Not fated, but just the general energy and tenor of the place is off.
Yeah. Yeah.
um and what creates that feeling is me um wanting to fight back against that feeling and wanting to do more and do better, and there's ego to that. And that's one of the things I've got to pay attention to when I'm doing poems like these, is to think that the poem's going to fix it. Um, like how do you write hope without a promise of fixing it? And
Right. Right.
therein
Yeah.
lies these poems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and everything has a yeah. How do you avoid the, hey, my work here is done? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could totally get that. So, well, I think with that, I think actually the I think we kind of covered a lot that was in um this a book. I did want to just last question, but then I'll let you
Yeah.
get to reading. But as far as a political poem, like obviously every poem is personal, every poem is political because those things are uh whatever. But as far as a poem that might be considered where you can say this is a political prose poem, right?
Mhm.
Um, is there a different way into or out of? Is there something about like putting it in prose that kind of uh, bends the ugly, clumsy, and unchanging thing of that is actually politics to something that, as I have worded it, better extracts the imprecise on the factual imagination? Is there, or is it just because this is what's presented, or you write
Sure.
what you're presented?
Well, I always get have more fun with the music of a prose poem, especially the way I do them, where there's normally not punctuation, where I get to repeat words and phrases in different ways. If you use a phrase once, it's typical. Twice, it's hitting the brakes. Three times, it's a slingshot. And so using phrases that way to sort of juice it, to play with it, um, and that's typically how my mind processes these political things. There's almost a refrain. I don't know if it's shouting or not, but it lends itself to that, and I think works well. Um, maybe I just spent too much damn time watching The West Wing, but like it's speechifying a little bit, right? It's like, I mean, if you can do that clear and concise, three tercet poem that knocks politics on its ass, then
Right, right, yeah.
great. If I
I
could do
mean,
that, I
yeah,
would.
yeah, absolutely. I think staccato can lends itself to
Yeah,
protest very
yeah.
well. So yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But just the way that, especially, let's say over the last 5 years, that I've used words and phrases that way, and tried to juice the energy a little bit with the repetitions. Sometimes doubling up the repetitions in the same
Yep.
poem, trying to use those as cues, the same way I would in like the book leak sequences, where there's a way that you can sort of ring a bell for the reader, that whether they were paying attention 20 poems ago or not, you use the same phrase.
Right.
It's
Yep.
it's it's a way to sort of bring them along through it.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, and even if it's not if it's not immediate, it's still that call to church, right?
yeah,
You get
absolutely. Well, and I don't care if it's lost. Like I put that's intentional, and you're wanting those things, to by the time they finish the book, there's a feeling that that last poem maybe caps, but there's been enough interplay, and especially in a book like this, where you're pulling so many things forward into these last political poems, that the meaning comes from all the stuff you already went through before we get there.
right. Yep. Well, no, I think too, like an initial reading or a rereading, you might not pick up on everything, but there is that feeling of like kind of the future of deja vu, like uh,
Mhm.
when you're reading something that knows why it's there compared to what was came before and everything
Mhm.
else, and I think that is apparent in a lot of your um work. But yeah, I think with that, I'll go ahead and I'm going to mute
Sure.
myself and give you the spotlight and read as many selections from the work as you'd like.
All right. Um, so I was going to start with the opening two poems, and then jump back. So the first section from So Much More, and by the way, how freaking cool is it to have my first hardcover? I'm really, really thrilled about this. Um, so I've never gotten to have a hardcover. I'm really excited. But the first section is, I have no intention of burying my body. I will tremble when the wind trembles. I will be dropped where the berries drop. I will be consumed as something that belongs in the cheeks of this world. Number 52. You can call it a hymn or whatever the fuck. If the fox eats one of my fingers, then I will finally get to be a fox. Um, so about half, two-thirds of the way through is the section with an empathy so fatal that I referenced earlier. I'm gonna read this sequence, and then finish with two of the prose poems at the end. Number 7. I want the bodies in the field to be okay. I sent my children into that field for the party I thought might welcome them. Now I'm afraid I sent them on to a burial ground. I sent them on to a burial ground. There was nowhere else to send them. I couldn't stand to have them and not share them with you. The plot is not so professional. That haphazard manufacturing of a sacrifice that didn't have to include the whole hearts of my kids. I didn't have to have kids. Once I did, I didn't have to teach them empathy. I did. So they are a small piece of the whole heart that might not feel them, their belonging in the beat. Take more of me is the default of every parent. Why did I teach those small eyes to do as I do? To do as I do is to put strangers on your back while you attempt to elevate their ankles out of the tide. What of my face? What of my face? The children want to be aggressive with their empathy. They want to hold the rooster of each day so they can show you the rooster of each day. They've already asked for tattoos of that rooster on their chests. I told them if empathy is an alarm, if you think empathy should be an alarm, then I find no fault in you making that permanent the minute you're 18. Until then, I'll keep buying orange to red markers for your early morning routine. I can't look at this any other way. The world can be so dry, and I was born with water, and I've given that water to my children and told them to give it away. And they did not blink, they closed their eyes and offered it, and now I am frightened for their safety. There is no other way. All those little pulses do not beat for war. We have done nothing to sew ourselves into the lining of this world. When this world stands up, we will be lost. If it's all already in your mouth, I'd encourage you to spit it out. Nobody ever remembers what is swallowed. I will never let people forget that you put your hands in that which you spit up for us and lifted it as an offering of sorts. I just want to hold the water line, to teach my children the water line, because they can swim and they can teach others to swim. The drowning has to be a choice, or this whole ocean is just a monster. The prolonged silence, it is not an unwillingness to answer. My children prefer the spectacle. They gather the shared sidewalk. They like it when big cats appear. They want to hug all the lions. They want to hold hands with the raccoon. They always have marshmallows in their pockets. They always collect the crowd. I have yet to explain the crowd. My feet sink into the swallowing. I volunteered for my shoulders are too wide for full empathy. I regret how often I've pulled up my own body. We are on the ground because our hands are not the tips of wings. We are meant to stay held next to a part of the nest of the all hunger. When we flatten ourselves to challenge gravity, that is when we drop our neighbors. When we make promises to the wind, we are as worthless as a held breath, spittle that escapes without any projection. Suns go dead. We have hope only because we know the other eyes blink as well. We are only alone when we believe ourselves to be sons. Go dead. And I don't know how to make that okay for children to know. I do know. I do know that if they hold your hand when you tell them, they will move on without horror. When there's nothing left to like, we can all rally around those people that bake pies and cut them into pieces. If you hold on to your roots only, you will drown in a black that is unable to thrust towards anyone else's sun. Um, and there's always a sequence or a poem in a book that once it's in its place, you figure out that you've actually have a book. Um, so like the in the Emily book, the Emily has a smile would have ruined the picture poem. Like it wasn't a book until that was in its place in that book. The with an empathy so fatal sequence for this book, it didn't come together. It didn't make sense. It didn't find its ending until that sequence was in the right part of the book. Um, yeah. So I'm gonna read four more poems and then say thank you many times. America chose to drown in the desert. I've heard the orchestra of children discovering that we cage any thrust of the garden before it can become the garden, that we take the clay to hold our flowers before they can take the clay to carry water to their mouths, that we are all limb and muscle and lost vein, and we have never had the heart for a nation that could survive the distinction between breathing and being forced to consume an unhealthy air, a measured and wild sharing of the landscape. We can compost, sure, but we compost the native beauty before we can think to name the bloom, before we ever thought to ask what the bloom was already called. We we are staggeringly qualified to end all life on this planet because we have already pulled a nation of mountains and rivers into the desert to bum rush the emerging children of the I cannot stop thinking about the children as I ask for their parents in a way so raw and searching that it frames the love I have for my own children as something like a funeral avoided, a funeral held without bodies, because all of the bodies that have been separated from each other, all of the bodies that once held each other, cultivated, distilled the purples hope can give into a perfume that rises towards the moon above the brush in a desert America chose to drown in, when all America needed to do was allow each footstep to be a gift, and the old way it was a gift. But instead, we opened our throats to meet the sun. Instead, we looked into the eyes of children separated from their parents and called their brokenness the flood we'd been waiting for. The wind has never cared. The wind has never cared about the chunks of flesh it pushes past, or the framing of that flesh as a receptacle for the seasons, and it is harder in the middle of that field party to stand up alone without getting kissed by the stones thrown recklessly from the road. Wow, the accuracy of hate is astounding. The bullets, the bullets always find a home, don't they? And as I flail, as I always flail, with more words than the washing off of words, I catch no peace. I dance with no peace. I am watched by a piece of Ohio that will always offer me a chair. I refuse the premise of a chair. Clearly, the difference of my body here instead of there is a promise to never be neatened by a threat, to threaten back only with the flex of my back, and to offer my body one more time than I should, so that my children know when my blood finally crisps upon this landscape, it will do so in defiance of a wind that never offered to stop carrying the cannon. Sounds, the arch, the arching, the gravity of the fall. Um, and so I wrote a couple of poems for Zina Heshem Beck right around the bombing that took place in the port of Beirut. Um, and I always knew she was brilliant, and her book Oh that came out a few years ago really sort of solidified that. Um, but it was one of the news stories that you read and immediately start to cry because every photo is of smoke and destruction, and every photo had that little part of the landscape or part of the city that was so awe-inspiringly beautiful that it couldn't help but sneak in a little bit. And you would see that, and you would see her tweeting about these things and what was happening. Um, and just you want to try to be a part of the voice that says it's going to be okay. And then when you can't be that voice, the anger just takes a hold of you, and ends up with a poem like this. And this is the last poem in the book. Um, and so for something that sort of searches back and forth through things, um, it ends with a great amount of anger, which for the people that know me, I'm a very nice, sort of happy, smiling person. Um, but when I go exploring, when I'm writing, um, it is difficult to not be angry all the time. And most of the projects I'm choosing now are to like I need to write towards hope, and I never get there necessarily. Like I don't necessarily get there. Um, but that pursuit in how angry I am and how angry I want to not be ends up producing some interesting things along the way. Um, so someday I will write a poem same way Ross Gay writes a poem, but I have not figured out how to do this. Um, anyway, this poem is called "Before the War Begins, the War Begins." The nitrogen braids the burials before the bottles of wine can be placed upon the windowsill. America prefers to use as target practice. And since peace is a hero that almost exists, the glass will chase the glass, the rubble will chase the rubble, and only the blood will rise high enough to be seen by the meetings that inhabit the meetings that have replaced the people, that replaced the people, that abstract the people into numbers. And since winning is losing, is winning, is as constantly almost as a hero that emerges from death, as if that is the same thing as living, as if any idea of war could refuse to drip before the tide takes our plasma as belonging to an ocean that can ever continue silently in this context. We have been given a howling that does not fit in our throats, that we have tried to shove down the throats of others. And when they spit it back at us, at America, we call that aggression. We call that the first volley. And when they decide it is best to choke on our gifts, to appease the directors of this terrible scene, we consider that a selfish act, that they would die without our help, without allowing us to emerge as somehow righteous, that because they bought wine, they drank the wine with love, with others that love, that they wanted to remember that wine by framing the bottle amidst the whole world. We took that simple reflection of light through a glass we did not make or get a chance to empty as a sign that only fire could bring us closer to the God we expected. Um, Thank you, Barton, and thank you, Donna. And I appreciate you folks giving me a chance to talk through this. And um, again, I tend to end readings by saying this, but man, getting to have this fun, get to spend the hour with Donna and with you, Barton, and with poetry. That was a safe hour for me, and I'll never not say thank you for those things. So I appreciate the fun and the safety and the poetry.
Well, also I would say thank you for being here. Thank you for the wonderful reading and for entertaining my inquiries. A couple just to speak to a couple things from the book. Thank you for trying to get to the bottom of our existence and understanding that inelegance welcomes us all differently. I do totally with the unfortunately the accuracy of hate is real, and anything we can do to remove the radar from that accuracy of hate is a step forward. But yeah, thank you for being here, and everybody here or everybody watching later, please check out, keep your eye on Small Harbor Publishing, that space, as so much more will be out November 7th. And with that, I'll thank Darren again, and I'll let everybody get out of here on a Sunday. Yeah, I think that'll be it. And love y'all. Have a good one.